The last 24 hours continue to see developments on the ground in Ukraine, even as both sides prepare for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which Yevgeny Prigozhin now thinks will probably happen around the 15th of May, but which others believe might happen in the second half of May or perhaps in early June. I will get on to the topic of the Ukrainian offensive shortly. But in the meantime, let's look at what's actually happening on the battlefields. Now, the first thing to say is that, as always, I'm going to start with Bakhmut, because that is where a lot of the current fighting is taking place, and it's been the major point of the battles in Ukraine for some time now. And there's been a report on TASS, which basically originates from Prigozhin, as far as I can make out, which says that the Wagner organization troops have advanced another 100 to 150 meters inside Bakhmut, and that the area that is controlled by Ukraine inside Bakhmut is now around 2.98 kilometers square. That's according to Prigozhin. And the report cites him as saying that the units of the Wagner organization have advanced 100 to 150 meters. The enemy has control over 2.98 square kilometers of Bakhmut's territory. A perhaps rather or slightly more informative report about what's happening has come from Redovka, which is this Russian newspaper, as I said, based in Smolensk, which has, as I said, abundant reporters on the ground, and which therefore can provide sometimes quite interesting and often, mostly, though not always, I should say, fairly accurate summaries of what's actually happening on the battlefield. Now, this report from Redovka, this is a machine translation, so it's somewhat clumsily worded. I'm going to slightly brush it up as I read it. But anyway, this is what this report, this dispatch from Redovka says. It says, Wagner troops are now close to the complete liberation of Bakhmut. One of the reporters told Novosti. Novosti is, of course, the Russian, one of the Russian news agencies. It's also part of the Rossiya Sevodnya group, which, by the way, includes RT. And the Redovka dispatch goes on to say there is no room, there's not enough room for maneuver for the remaining Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut, as the front line is constantly approaching. That, in other words, this area of less than 3 kilometers square, which is still under Ukrainian control, is now so small that it really isn't possible any longer to shift men and machines around inside it. And the report then says that nonetheless, the Ukrainians continue to try to reinforce their positions in Bakhmut, and they recently, for example, sent a convoy of military equipment with artillery to Bakhmut. They continue to transfer reserves there, but in each and every case, these units, these reinforcements that continue to be funneled into Bakhmut, come under withering Russian artillery fire. The report also suggests that American journalists have been in the area in anticipation of some kind of Ukrainian counteroffensive, but up to now they've been disappointed. That counteroffensive has not actually taken place up to now. And he says that the only area of Bakhmut that remains securely under Ukrainian control is a small quarter where part of the railway is located. There's some high-rise buildings there. It seems that these are, by the way, not residential buildings, and that part of them form part of a complex of a medical institute, which is, however, located on a small height, and therefore provides an opportunity for the Ukrainians to look down into the town and to shell Russian forces located there. Now, that's what these two reports say, and the suggestion that's been made is that, in fact, it's likely that Bakhmut will fall under Russian control in roughly a week's time, though there's been some suggestions that it might take a little longer. But this, I should say, is the first time, to my knowledge, that there's been suggestions, actual reports from actual Russian officials giving some sort of a timeline. Now, a Russian commentator called Nabrezhne Intel has provided a slightly more detailed account of what's going on, and I will read it. I should say that I've had some suggestions that Nabrezhne Intel is not always been the most reliable source about the situation on the battlefields. However, I've also heard that the team at Slavyangrad has been working with this particular person, and that they've been assisting this person to improve some of his reporting. The problem is not so much with the information this person gets as the way he reports it, or so I understand. And anyway, the team at Slavyangrad has been helping this person, and the result is that this person's reports have improved in quality and have become more accurate. This is what I've heard. I want to stress I have no knowledge of who this person, Nabrezhne Intel, is, and I don't know much of his background, but the fact is that these reports do appear on Slavyangrad, and as I've said, I have a great deal of trust in the reliability of reports that appear there. And anyway, this is what the Nabrezhne Intel source says about the situation in Bakhmut as of this morning. In the Khromovsky district, Wagner are conducting successful offensive operations in the direction of the post office and other areas. Nearby, in the residential district, fighting is taking place in Vyzvoliteliv Donbasu Street. Further down on Vyzvoliteliv Donbasu Street, fighting is also taking place in the direction of the second remaining district under the control of the Ukrainian military. This district is heavily industrialized and has high-rise buildings similar to Optinoye, what we saw in Optinoye. This is the village, to remind us, just south of Bakhmut, which the Russians captured some weeks ago. And can I just say that this report seems consistent with what we've just heard from Raidovka, that there are some high-rise buildings that have to be cleared, and that they now remain the main anchor of the Ukrainian defense. And the report finishes on Tchaikovsky Street after the capture of the Artyomovsk Medical College. Fighting is now taking place opposite the famous intersection in the direction of school number 12. I presume this is the intersection between Tchaikovsky and Yubileyny Street, which I discussed recently. And it says that the 63rd Territorial Defense Brigade of the Ukrainian army remains entrenched in school number 12. Only around 6% of Bakhmut remains under Ukrainian control. And that all seems to me relatively consistent with what Radovka is saying. Obviously, it's a different source. It's not impossible that the two are to some extent echoing what the other is saying. But on balance, I believe that these reports are true. And it's been suggested that the Ukrainians will want to cling on to a part of Bakhmut, the part of Bakhmut that they control, to spoil the effect of Russia's Victory Day celebrations on the 9th of May. I have to say, if that is the thinking, if Ukrainian soldiers are being sacrificed for such a purpose, then I think that is entirely wrong and most inappropriate. And just as I've been giving this report, I see that Boris Rogin, the personage who refers to himself as Colonel Kassad and who is one of the most reliable reporters altogether of this war, I would put him at almost the same level of reliability as Slavyangrad, slightly below, for various reasons I'm not going into. But Boris Rogin is an extremely reliable commentator, and he's now provided a report of the fighting in Bakhmut, which seems to me to be of a very similar nature. He says, and again I'm taking this actually from Slavyangrad's translation, that the slow advance of the Wagner forces in the western outskirts of Bakhmut continues. The Ukrainian military is gambling on delaying the defense of the block of high-rise buildings for at least another week, ideally until May 10th to 12th, in order to hand over the remaining positions after May 9th. That's the day Victory Day is celebrated in Russia, as happened with the case of Mariupol. And the report goes on to say, this is from Boris Rogin, after the loss of the high-rise buildings and the final ousting from Bakhmut, the Ukrainian military planned to hold on to Krasnoye, he means Ivanivska, and Khromovo for some time before they retreat to the main defense line in the Chasov Yar area. And I would say here that a Ukrainian soldier, apparently a fairly senior Ukrainian soldier, very well-informed Ukrainian soldier, was reported in the Western media some weeks ago as saying that Chasov Yar is essentially undefendable. It's a small place consisting of low-rise buildings, mainly residential buildings. It is neither the size nor the depth nor the sort of buildings that can be defended effectively. But for the moment, it does seem as if after Bakhmut and its environs are finally lost, that is where the Ukrainians intend to make their stand. And Rogin continues, to the west of Khromovo, fierce battles continue for control of the Chasov Yar Khromovo route. In the last week, both sides have suffered losses here. And he says that in Ivanivskaya, Bogdanovka, and Orekhovo, Vasilyevka, there have been no changes and there have been no significant advances to Novomarkovo in the Kramatorsk direction. Well, that's unsurprising, since clearly the Russians, the Wagner organization, are intent for the moment in finally clearing Bakhmut. Now, these are all Russian reports. I should say that the spokesperson of the Ukrainian grouping that is defending Bakhmut has also made a statement. He says that Ukraine remains in full control of the road that passes through from Chasov Yar through Khromovo to Bakhmut. I have to say that this person's claims have on occasion proved to be wrong. For example, at one point he was categorically denying Russian reports that they had captured the main administrative building in Bakhmut and raised their flag there. He was saying that this was untrue. It subsequently turned out that the building had indeed been captured and the Russians had indeed raised their flag over it exactly as they said. And I would also say that this person's claim that the Ukrainians are in full control of the road through Khromovo is not fully consistent with the photographic and film evidence which I have seen, which shows Russian forces, which has shown Russian forces located, at least for a time, on the surface of this road, and also Boris Rogzin's report that fighting for control of the road continues to take place west of Khromovo. So anyway, that's the situation in Bakhmut. There's been quite a lot of information about events in other places on the battlefields. And it takes a very, very interesting form. Firstly, there is a report that the Russians have been carrying out very heavy air raids in the Avdiivka area, again, apparently on a huge scale, and also in Vuhledar. And I've already said that in Vuhledar they seem to be undertaking an operation to basically destroy, using heavy aerial bombs, all the high-rise buildings that dominate Vuhledar and which have enabled the Ukrainians to essentially look down upon the entire landscape in this area, which is which is basically as flat as a pancake. Anyway, it seems that the Russians are now launching heavy bombing raids on Vuhledar, presumably using these precision-guided Fab 500 GLONASS guided bombs, which have been making such a big impact over the last few weeks. And it seems that the Russian Air Force has also been extremely active over the Avdiivka area. And again, I can't provide full explanations as to exactly what is happening, but again, it looks as if this is an aerial attack using guided bombs once more, heavy guided bombs, and we've seen the effect of these guided bombs over the course of the last few weeks. However, there's another report from Radovka, and it is a very interesting one, and it discusses what is happening in another part of the battlefield entirely, which is Kherson region. Now, about a couple of days ago, there was a report that the Ukrainian forces in Kherson region had managed to cross the Dnieper and had entrenched themselves in a small area of marshy ground on the east bank of the Dnieper River. What was strange about that story was that the Western media continued to run it for several days, even after it had been denied, not just by the Russians, but by the Ukrainians as well. To reiterate again, there's no evidence that the Ukrainians have taken control of any area east of the Dnieper River. Raids by each side across the Dnieper seem to take place pretty much all the time. I'm not sure that the logic of these raids, but they are without consequence. In any event, what does seem to have happened is that over the last week or so, the Russians have been launching major artillery strikes across the Dnieper River into western Kherson region, into the area of Kherson region that that the Ukrainians now control. And Redovka reports it in this way. According to a Redovka source from the front, so in other words, probably a Russian soldier, or perhaps a soldier from one of the militias, in the last week, in the Kherson direction, the Russian military has been taking active steps to eliminate enemy equipment, Ukrainian, in other words, equipment. A successful defeat involving both cannon, in other words, tube artillery, and rocket artillery, has been observed along the coastline of the Dnieper in the area of Stanislav, a coastal village west of Kherson, all the way north to Berislav, a district center east of Kherson. The source clarifies that these attacks have not been carried out by the Air Force, as one might assume, based on the trends of the recent weeks with the use of FABs, that's to say precision-guided bombs. So far, the Russian Air Force has not been operating in this particular area. All the results have been achieved through artillery fire, which has become much fiercer over the last few days. So that suggests a major Russian fire attack, artillery assault on Ukrainian positions west of the Dnieper. And I think that this is true, and it may account for a rather odd report that I saw yesterday, that Ukrainian troops who have been stationed in Kherson city, a city which the Russians withdrew from back in November, that Ukrainian troops stationed in Kherson city have withdrawn from Kherson city. And that's a report, which, by the way, I can't confirm, but it does seem plausible. And this came shortly after another confirmed report that the Ukrainian mayor of Kherson has called on the civilian population of Kherson city, that's what's left of the civilian population of Kherson city, to leave. So that suggests very, very dense Russian artillery fire on Ukrainian positions west of the Dnieper. And presumably what the Russians are doing is they're hunting and destroying Ukrainian military units located west of the Dnieper, who they think might be involved in some sort of crossing of the Dnieper in support of whatever offensive Ukraine might eventually launch from Zaporozhye region. Well, this is an interesting report in itself. And I'm also going to make a further observation. Note that this Redovka report says that the Russian Air Force has not so far been operating in this area. And this is the same area where that S-300 brigade was destroyed by those Lancet drones just a few days ago, as discussed by me very extensively in 2 recent videos. I have been reading some very interesting explanations for that event. Now, over the last few weeks, as we've seen, the Russian Air Force has become extremely active over the Ukrainian battlefields. And this is a consequence of the progressive depletion and breakdown of Ukraine's air defense system. It's also undoubtedly partly the result of the introduction into the Russian Air Force's armory of large numbers of precision-guided glided bombs of a sort that Russia had not historically used on a large scale previously. And this renewed activity of the Russian Air Force has come at a very heavy cost to Ukraine, and it seems that the Ukrainians have tried to respond by forward deploying some of the few S-300 missile systems that they have left. The Russian aircraft that launch these bombs fly at medium to high altitudes, and they can be located around 40 kilometers from the target. And that means that a air defense missile, in order to strike at these aircraft with any prospect of success, needs to be both long range and also deployed closer to the battlefronts. Now, Ukraine has only one missile system, or has had only one missile system, that can perform this role, and that is the S-300 system. And it seems that the Ukrainians have tried to force back Russian aircraft by forward deploying some S-300 batteries of the few that they have left, both to Donbass and to Kherson region, in order to try to shoot down or at least interfere with the operation of these Russian aircraft with their glided bombs. But bringing S-300 batteries close to the front line exposes those batteries to attack by Russian artillery and Russian drones. And a couple of days ago, there was a report that the Russians had destroyed several air defense radars associated with the S-300 system in Donbass. And then about 2 days ago or 3 days ago, they were able to destroy an entire S-300 brigade at Snigarevka in Kherson region, west of the Dnieper River. So that's one effect of this introduction of Russian bombers into the battlefronts. The Ukrainian air defense system is not only becoming depleted, as the Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov has himself acknowledged, but it is now becoming more vulnerable as it is being tasked, as it is finding itself tasked with providing air cover to ground troops in situations which is making it vulnerable to attack by Russian artillery and Russian drones and other Russian weapon systems, with the effects that we have now seen. Now, I remember a couple of days ago, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas talked about the dilemma the Ukrainians are facing in terms of operating their new Patriot systems. They are apparently expecting to receive a total of 3 Patriot brigades, 2 from Germany and the Netherlands, and they've already been supplied, 1 eventually from the United States. The problem is that, firstly, these are not being supplied in anything like the numbers that would be needed to reproduce the effect of the original Ukrainian air defense system that has been largely destroyed. Secondly, the Patriot system itself has limitations in range and capability that the S-300 system didn't have. But thirdly, Ukraine would face a difficult choice if it forward deployed Patriot missile systems in order to defend its ground troops. It would expose them to exactly the same kind of destruction that we've seen happen to that S-300 battery that was destroyed in Snigarevka in Kherson region. And of course, a destruction of a Patriot battery in that kind of way would be a big event, one which it would be impossible to conceal from the Western media in the way that the destruction of the S-300 battery has in effect been concealed by the Western media. I haven't seen a single report about this event, hugely consequential though it is. Instead, as I discussed yesterday, and even today, by the way, the Western media persists in talking about this drone strike on a fuel depot in Crimea. There's a big fire, but as I said, a fairly local fire. The one thing that Russia isn't short of is fuel. So, an inconsequential event in itself. But you wouldn't think so from the way it's been covered. It's been relentlessly covered by the media as if this was a big event, media in the West, as if this was a big event, even as they ignore the massive Russian missile strikes of the previous day, the destruction of this S-300 battery in Kherson region, and those sort of things. If ever you had doubts about the objectivity of some of the coverage that you're getting in the Western media, this failure to comment on this event in Kherson region provides confirmation of it. And those who will say that this attack, despite the film and photographic evidence, has not been confirmed, well, all I can say about that is that, of course, the Russians have confirmed it. The Ukrainians have not. When it works the other way round, when the Ukrainians make all kinds of claims, they are invariably reproduced in the Western media as truth, and sometimes the Western media reports things like the entrenchment of the Ukrainian forces east of the Kherson region in this area of marshy territory, after the Ukrainians themselves have denied it. Anyway, that's all I get to say about this incident. Overall, the overall picture is of the Russians continuing to grind the Ukrainians down in Donbass, weaken Ukrainian forces, deplete Ukraine's arsenal of weapons and machines. All of this on the eve of this offensive that Ukraine is supposed to launch. Now, there have been two very interesting articles about this offensive, actually three very interesting articles about this offensive. The first one, which I get to turn to, is in the London Times, and it appears today. And it has a rather extraordinary and, I think, frankly, shocking title. Ukraine isn't ready for its big offensive, but it has no choice. Kiev is locked into a spring or summer push, despite burning through ammunition so fast that the West can't keep up. And then it says, luckily, Russia is out of ideas too, which, well, straightforwardly, it simply isn't the case. It simply isn't true. And then we are told that some of the problems of this offensive, there's a lot of things here about the skill of the Ukrainians, the success that they've had in the past, those kind of things, the fact that they sometimes catch the Russians by surprise, the story of the massive fire at the Russian oil depot in Crimea, which I've just talked about, that's talked up to ludicrous levels. But then it goes on to say, whilst the Ukrainians are moving quickly to assimilate their 230 new and reconditioned Western tanks and 1,550 armoured vehicles, they still lack proper air defences for any big offensive. That puts them at risk from Russian air power. Western sources are also uncertain whether senior commanders can adapt to the new systems as well as their soldiers on the ground. And then it gets interesting. Yet Kiev has little real choice but to launch a major spring or summer offensive. Its leaders are increasingly boxed in. As an American defense official put it, the Ukrainians have surprised us as well as Putin in the past. I'm not sure in what way, by the way, but we'll come to that in a moment. But have much less room for a maneuver now, and the Russians know it. And then it goes on to say that President Zelensky has managed the West with great skill, but to maintain its support, he has to show what Washington insiders rather tastelessly call a return on investment. And then what is in some ways the most interesting paragraph of all in the whole article, Zelensky must also balance domestic politics. Hawks such as Kyrylo Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, prevent any meaningful talk about negotiations, even though some in the government think now is the time to put out feelers. And I'm going to discuss the implications of that shortly. And just note that sentence. Note also that this is said just a few days after the telephone conversation between Zelensky and Xi Jinping. Anyway, the article goes on this specific point. One Western diplomat in Kiev described a surreal parallel experience as his interlocutors discuss potential formats for negotiations one evening and then shout that there can be no talks with Russia in public the next day. Now, I am assuming that is a Western ambassador, and I'm assuming that amongst the Ukrainian officials, he is talking to none other than Zelensky himself. But anyway, to press on, there are also sharp limits to what the West can do. Whilst there are calls for new and more weapons to be provided, from ATACMS missiles to F-16 jets, it is not just caution or parsimony that holds the West back. One of the key issues is that ammunition. Sending more weapon systems is of little value without the shells, bullets, or missiles they are consuming at a prodigious rate. At present, for example, the Ukrainians expend more 155mm shells in a month than America produces in a year. The West is investing new production capacity but this takes months or years. Ammunition cannot be conjured out of the air, and Paris is blocking the EU from buying supplies outside the bloc. This is typical, by the way, of the British. If there's a problem, it's the French who are obviously to blame for it. Anyway, the article then goes on. Kiev will have to attack regardless, probably aiming at some ambitious target, such as the southern city of Melitopol, a road or rail hub whose liberation would cut the so-called land bridge between Crimea and Russia. Moscow knows this beyond the continued grinding assaults on the cities of Bakhmut and Vuhledar, it is also moving into a defensive mode. And then it talks about how the British Defence Ministry is claiming that the Russian casualty rate has fallen by almost a third. Yes, it has, but I don't place any reliance on British calculations of Russian casualty figures. And then it goes on to say, the article finishes, the Russians are digging in with satellite photos showing a growing array of trenches and fortifications, especially along the likely lines of a Ukrainian attack in the south. It is, of course, possible Kiev will strike elsewhere, such as the city of Donetsk, but whilst this would be symbolically powerful, it would be a tough fight and of much less practical value. And then there's an awful lot of a completely speculative and unsubstantiated nature about the supposed problems that the Russians allegedly have with their equipment, which I'm going to skip because, to be frank, in my opinion, it is of no value. Let me just counter one particular point that is repeatedly made. The Ukrainians did not catch the Russians by surprise in their offensives last autumn. Talk about the offensive in Kherson region, the one that began at the end of August. Talk about that offensive started to appear in the Ukrainian and British media as early as March 2022. I remember reading articles in the Daily Telegraph specifically about it as early as that time. So the Russians were fully aware that the Ukrainians were going to launch an offensive in Kherson region months before that offensive was launched. And as I recall, in August, they reinforced their positions in Kherson region by transferring a large number of airborne troops, paratroopers in other words, to Kherson region to try to defend that area. As for Kharkiv region, I also remember many discussions, much commentary in Russia about the prospects of a Ukrainian attack there. And I also remember that Ryba, the collective of journalists that is one of the key sources of news about the fighting in Ukraine, was warning about an imminent Ukrainian offensive for at least 2 weeks before it took place. The problem the Russians faced in the summer was not that they did not have adequate notice of what the Ukrainians were going to do. It is that they anyway lacked troops. They didn't have enough troops to defend the entire battle line. And the result was that they pulled most of their troops out of Kharkiv region before the Ukrainian attack there took place. And also, eventually, they decided that the defense of Kherson region was simply not worthwhile, given the logistic and supply issues. But like so many claims that have been made about this war, the legend that Ukraine caught the Russians by surprise with its offensives in autumn 2022 is a myth. It has no basis in fact or in the actual record. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this article. Now, a number of absolutely key points to make. Sorry about what I want to say about the contents of this article, but a number of key points to make about it. First of all, what this article does, to my mind, is that it highlights the responsibility of the West for what is about to happen. Here we see an article saying that the Ukrainians are boxed in. They're not ready for this offensive. They don't have air defense. They're out of ammunition. The troops probably aren't adequately trained. The Russian defenses are far too strong. The Russians have advanced warning of the offensive that's coming, and they've built up fortified lines, and they've reinforced, they have control of the air. It's a very, very tall order indeed for the Ukrainians to break through, particularly if, as I strongly suspect, they're also outnumbered. But despite all of these problems, the Ukrainians feel that they have to go forward. They have to press on with this counter-offensive because the West demands it. The West requires that this counter-offensive be launched. As the Times says, Western officials talk tastelessly about a return on their investment. Now, I find that unbelievable. I find that extraordinary. The Western leaders know all about the situation. They know about how fragile the prospects of success in this offensive is, how fragile the prospect for its success is. They must know that this offensive is going to result in hundreds, perhaps thousands of people being killed, Ukrainian and Russian, but perhaps mostly Ukrainian. And yet, they are still pushing Ukraine into launching this offensive. Now, the article says that there is no choice. Of course there is a choice. If the prospects of success are so limited, if you can't keep up with Ukraine's needs, you can't supply Ukraine with the ammunition and the air defenses and all of those things that would at least give this offensive a strong prospect of success, even if it doesn't guarantee final victory. Well, if that's the situation, then you tell the Ukrainians to call it off. I would have thought this was obvious. But the article tells us that that is not what the West is doing. And notice the further problem that the Ukrainians have. It seems that there are some people in Ukraine who understand how fragile the situation has become, how the situation is close to collapse, how the good chance that the offensive will fail, but they also face the problems of their own hardliners. And Kyrylo Budanov, the extraordinary intelligence chief, military intelligence chief of Ukraine, the person who a few weeks ago was being talked about as a potential new defense minister in place of the current defense minister, Alexei Reznikov. The person who, by the way, I strongly suspect is the mastermind, if that's the right word, behind some of these extraordinary Ukrainian attacks on people like Daria Dugina, Vladlen Tatarsky, the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, operations of that nature. He apparently, and the people around him, are a major obstacle to negotiations. They are continuing to insist that the war must be fought and fought on until some sort of final victory. And the West knows about Budanov. They know about the role Budanov is playing. And yet, they're not doing, despite their knowledge of how fragile the situation in Ukraine is, they're not doing what they should be doing in this situation. He's not only saying that the offensive should be called off, but telling Budanov to get back into his box and not to interfere with operational decisions made by the Ukrainian General Staff and the Ukrainian government. My own view is that they should be doing a lot more about Budanov than just that. I'm not somebody who normally encourages interference in the internal affairs of another country, far from it. But given the extent to which the West is now effectively running the show in Ukraine anyway, I think given that Budanov and others like him are being identified as a problem, I think it's entirely proper in this kind of situation where lives are at stake for the West to demand his sacking. None of that is happening. Instead, we're going to forge ahead with this offensive. Now, that's an article in the Times. Maybe some will say there's an alternative view. Maybe some people in the military somewhere think that perhaps prospects are not quite as bleak as is being outlined here, and that just possibly the situation might not be as bad as is being suggested. Well, I'm going to read comments made apparently by no less a person than the Chief of General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces, General Raymond Andrzejczak. Now, I apologize first of all to all my Polish friends and to other people, Polish people, by the fact that I'm almost certainly mispronouncing his name. But anyway, that's the best I can do. And if some people want to come forward and tell me how to pronounce that name properly, please feel welcome. Anyway, there's a report about certain comments he made in a magazine, an internet magazine called Zubu Brothers, and I'm going to read it out. Andrzejczak said that the situation doesn't look good for Kiev at all when considering the economic dynamics of this conflict, with him drawing particular attention to finance, infrastructure issues, social issues, technology, and food production. From this vantage point, Andrzejczak predicts that Russia can continue conducting its special operation for 1 to 2 more years before it begins to field any structural pressure to curtail its activities. Why does Andrzejczak think it'll be different? Things will be different in 2 years? I don't know. There's no sign of it at the moment. On the contrary, all the indications are that the Russian economy is responding very successfully to what he calls structural pressure. But never mind. He then goes on to say this. Andrzejczak goes on to say this. Kiev is burning through tens of billions of dollars worth of aid, yet it remains still very far away from its maximum objectives. Andrzejczak said candidly that Poland's Western partners aren't properly assessing the challenges that stand in the way of Ukraine's victory, including those connected to the race of logistics, war of attrition that the NATO chief, that's to say Stoltenberg, declared in mid-February. I would suggest, in light of what Andrzejczak is saying, that the NATO leadership, Stoltenberg and co., Borrell as well, perhaps ought to start listening to what I've been saying on this channel, and perhaps more specifically to Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, and Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin in his various articles at the Rusi Forum, and Douglas McGregor, and Scott Ritter, and all of those people, because if it is indeed the case, as Andrzejczak is saying, that Poland's Western partners aren't properly assessing the challenges that stand in the way of Ukraine's victory, including those connected to the race of logistics, war of attrition, then frankly, they're blind and deaf and have chosen to be so because many people are talking about it. The article goes on to say, Andrzejczak himself admitted, we just don't have ammunition. The industry is not ready not only to send equipment to Ukraine, but also to replenish our stocks, which are melting. Considering that Poland is Ukraine's third most important patron behind the Anglo-American axis, that, by the way, is almost certainly wrong. I would say that Poland has provided a lot more equipment to Ukraine than Britain has done. Just saying. This strongly suggests that all other NATO members are struggling just as much as it is to keep up the pace, scale of and scope of support, if not more, since many are a lot smaller and thus less capable of contributing in this respect. And then we go on to read, this is from the original Polish article, this observation means that Kiev's upcoming offensive will likely be its last hurrah prior to resuming peace talks with Russia, since the West won't be able to keep up its assistance for much longer. Andrzejczak seems keenly aware of this politically inconvenient fact, hence why he wants his side to give its proxies as much as possible until the end of that operation, in the hopes that they can then be in a comparatively more advantageous position by the time these talks commence, which is I've already discussed the absurdity of that, and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said that this approach, this idea that sending more weapons to Ukraine and then expecting that its success in an offensive will lead to peace talks is, in Lavrov's words, schizophrenia. Anyway, I won't go back over that again. But the same bleak outlook, this time from no less a person than a serving military officer within the NATO system, the commander of the Polish armed forces, or at least its chief of general staff. And whilst I'm on this topic, I've seen a report that no less a person than the US general, who is the overall commander of NATO forces in Europe, has now come forward and said that even though the war may have caused the Russian military to be somewhat degraded, in what respect? He admits that the Russian army is now bigger than it was when this war began. So the other side is getting stronger. The West side, Ukraine, is getting weaker. And yet, rather than draw the logical conclusions from this, the West is pressing Ukraine into a counteroffensive, which will burn up its equipment even faster, leave it in a weaker position, cause thousands of men to die, and all because, as the Times tastelessly, as the Times says, some Western officials tastelessly say that Ukraine must show a return of the West's investment. Well, I'm going to finish this cycle of articles by going to what is in some ways the single most perceptive of them, which is by Larry Johnson on his blog Sonar 21, son of American Revolution. And he's done what he thinks is what he rather humbly says is a rather less analytical article than usual. Well, I disagree. I think this is a very fine summary of the situation. And what he's talking about here is about that Zelensky, Xi Jinping telephone call. Now, I've already given my own view. I've already explained what it was that Xi Jinping said to Zelensky. But Larry Johnson has a lot to add, and it is important to understand this call between Zelensky and Xi Jinping in the context of what the London Times is telling us about the surreal atmosphere in Kiev, that some Ukrainian officials say in private, we have to negotiate with the Russians. We are at that point where we simply cannot go on. But then, under Western pressure and under the pressure of people like Kirill Bogdanov, and bear in mind, if what I think about him and his activities is true, this is a very ruthless man indeed, and he is in charge of some very ruthless and ideologically committed people as well. Anyway, in fear of people like that and of the response for the West, those same Ukrainian officials who talk about need to negotiate with the Russians to put out feelers to them. In the evening, by the morning, they're coming out and making fiery comments to the media about how the war must be fought on until victory, until Crimea is captured, Donbass is captured, Moscow has fallen, Putin has been overthrown, whatever extreme demands these people make. And I'm going to cover here this call, this Larry Johnson's comments about this call between Xi Jinping and Zelensky. And I think it's very important, and I think it provides a lot more context about that call. And it's helpful to read all of this, as I said, bear in mind that point that I made previously about the fact that the Ukrainians understand that they need to seek peace and are perhaps looking for a way out, even though they are constrained and cannot say it publicly and are being strong-armed into an offensive which perhaps they don't believe in. So this is what Larry Johnson says. Let's start with some facts. Zelensky called Xi, not the other way round. And Zelensky reportedly did this without consulting Washington, which left the Biden foreign policy team fuming. Now, I was not aware of that. I did not know that that was the case. And I'd assumed that the Americans had been told in advance that there would be this call. After all, they've been saying that Xi Jinping should speak to Zelensky. So I thought that they had been briefed in advance by the Ukrainians that this call would take place. It turns out, and Larry Johnson is an extremely well-informed commentator, that this was not the case. The Ukrainians went behind the Americans and talked to the Chinese without telling the Americans first. And that is important, and it's important given what we know, that it is the Americans, the West, that is pushing Ukraine into this offensive. Anyway, to continue with what Larry Johnson says, more telling is that Xi did the conversation with a Russian translator. Got it? China supposedly could not find a single Chinese linguist who spoke Ukrainian. Well, are you buying that? I am not. Well, of course, that's a ludicrous idea. The idea that China doesn't have people, translators, who are able to conduct simultaneous translation in Ukrainian as opposed to Russian is fanciful in the extreme. It is a ridiculous idea. And the fact that the Chinese did that shows that they were making a very, very powerful point, as Larry Johnson goes on to say. China, a nation skilled at diplomacy and the talent of sending powerful messages with subtle gestures. This is not a subtle gesture. It's about the one thing where I disagree with Larry Johnson. I think it's a very straightforward gesture, and one which some people in Ukraine will not have appreciated. Deliberately forced Zelensky to deal with C using the Russian language. Whilst it is possible that the Chinese were just being kind to Zelensky, who is not a native Ukrainian speaker, and his grasp of that language is awkward at best, it is more likely that China was reminding Ukraine that it is in a new partnership with Russia. It is, of course, the second. That is clearly what this is all about. I think it was also a Chinese way of reminding Zelensky about his past, about the fact that previously he not only was prepared to speak Russian in public, that he is a Russian speaker, and that he won elections. He won the presidency in Ukraine, posing as the peace candidate. So it's a very clever message and a very strong one. And as I said, it will have alarmed some people, annoyed some people in Ukraine. Anyway, to continue, Xi Jinping, according to the Chinese readout, was very direct with Zelensky by warning him not to support the US policy towards Taiwan. About that, Larry Johnson is right. I discussed that in my analysis of the Chinese readout. I noticed that without exception, the Western media has missed that point entirely. The readout specifically says that the two countries, China and Ukraine, must show mutual support for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is essentially the Chinese telling the Ukrainians that Ukraine must support China over Taiwan. Anyway, to continue, if Ukraine fails to heed that warning, then China will treat Ukraine with the same disdain it reserves for the inept Biden administration. Absolutely. And then Larry Johnson goes on to say the West foolishly believes that Xi Jinping views Vladimir Putin as his personal organ grinder's monkey, an insignificant second-class toy of no importance. Wrong. Putin has defense technologies that Xi does not. The recent summit in Moscow between the Russian and Chinese leaders, not just Xi, but his foreign and defense ministers as well, delivered a powerful message to the world. Xi came to Putin, not the other way around. Well, all that is true. But think about what's happened. The Ukrainians, some people in Ukraine, we're told this now by the London Times, are talking with each other about sending out feelers for peace. Zelensky calls the Chinese, calls Xi Jinping, without telling the Americans first. He blindsides them. And he has a discussion with Xi Jinping through a Russian translator. I mean, I don't think it's particularly difficult to understand what is happening here. It gives the strong impression of a drowning man clutching at straws. But consider what Zelensky's up against. I discussed yesterday articles in the Daily Telegraph, including one by Richard Kemp, that if the Ukrainian offensive fails, there should not be peace talks. There should be more war. Ukraine should be provided with even more weapons. Richard Kemp said that the West should redouble its efforts to support Ukraine in military terms. Redouble its efforts. You could say double down if you prefer, because that's the level of the gamble that implies. And we're also told by the London Times that as well as these other problems, the Ukrainians have these internal difficulties that people like Budanov are standing in the way of peace talks. Well, I'm going to finish this video today by saying that I have a deep sense of foreboding and tragedy about this whole business. Anybody who is familiar with Greek tragedy, which as a Greek person I am, knows that what leads to the tragic fall of the tragic hero is, by the way, a more ambiguous word in Greek than it is in some Western languages. Anyway, what leads to that fall is a series of decisions, each of which could have been avoided, but all of which lead to that inexorable outcome. There's choices every step of the way, but the hero, if I can continue to use that term, finds himself, it's always a he, well, there's been a few women heroes actually as well, Antigone, Clytemnestra, we won't go into too much detail about that. The tragic hero finds him or herself always under a compulsion to make the wrong one. Sometimes doing that knowingly. And that, it seems to me, is what is now happening to Ukraine. One gets a sense of a Ukrainian leadership which has both maneuvered itself and been maneuvered into a disastrous position, both for itself and more especially for its country, for their country. They know that their only real way forward, their only proper way forward, is to seek peace, that they're up against a military-industrial colossus against whom they cannot in the end prevail, and yet, through this disastrous combination of hardliners, both in the West and at home, they're obliged to persist with a war. As a result, hundreds, thousands of people are going to die. An offensive is going to be launched, which even Zelensky himself, he's just made some comments now, he's admitted that, this is not going to be the decisive battle. His foreign minister, Kuleba, is saying the same. This is not going to be the decisive battle. Even if the offensive succeeds, it's not going to end the war. The war is going to continue. Zelensky talked about it continuing for 5 to 10 years. 10 years. Of course, I don't for a moment believe that he really thinks that, given all that we've heard. But anyway, that's what he is saying. So even he doesn't expect this offensive to achieve decisive outcomes. And yet, he goes ahead with it because he feels himself afraid and under constraints and cannot do otherwise. Let me repeat again. It's the Times of London, which is now saying that the Ukrainians have no choice, have not been left with any choice. They are in effect boxed in. Now, I said earlier that the responsibility of the West here is very high. It's clear that this war is now being driven first and foremost by an ideological faction in the United States, with its outriders in Brussels and London. Seymour Hersh has written about the fact that there is growing disquiet in Washington about the members of this faction, that there's a major pushback against them. I've no doubt that that is true. I've discussed at length how there are obvious indicators of this. The Rand Corporation report of a few months ago, other indicators since. But of course, it's important now, or so it seems to me, for those other people, the people in Washington who are opposed to this faction, the people in the West who might oppose it also, certain people within the German government, for example, President Macron, people like that. Now, to find their courage and to come out and speak openly and honestly about the situation and to try to bring this horror to a stop. I have no confidence that they will do so, but if they fail to do so, then they should be under no doubt that whatever disaster awaits will be the result of their own lack of courage, and that they will share equally with the perpetrators the responsibility for the consequences. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. It only remains for me to wish you a very good day and to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. That you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, and by going to our shop and buying yourself the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those amazing things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.